In the third week of August, 1988, the heat in Grayson County had settled in not as a guest, but as a landlord. It owned the air, the baked soil, and the silence that fell between the drone of cicadas. The corn in the fields was a total loss. The stalks bleached to the color of old bone, the leaves curled tight as fists. The creeks, which had always been reliable, were now just veins of cracked mud and smooth, sun-warmed stones. The county's collective prayer for rain had gone unanswered for 74 days. Arthur Pearsall stood on his porch and looked east across the 200 acres that had been in his family since 1891. He was 72 years old, a man made of the same tough, unyielding material as the hickory trees that lined his property. His face was a map of his life, creased by sun and worry, but his eyes were clear and calm. They were the color of the sky on a good day, the kind of blue that seemed to hold a long memory. He did not look at the ruined corn. He had already accepted it. His gaze was fixed further out, on the low ridge that marked the eastern boundary of his land. The pipeline was coming. It was the talk of the county, the only thing that could compete with the drought for attention at the feed store and the diner. The Transcontinental Gas Company was laying a new 36-inch main, a steel artery that would carry natural gas from the fields of Texas to the cities of the Northeast. It cut a diagonal swath across the state, and its path, drawn on a surveyor's map in some distant office, ran directly through the heart of Grayson County. For most farmers, it was a complicated blessing. The company paid well for the easement, a ribbon of land 100 feet wide. The money was a lifeline in a year when everything else had failed. It was enough to pay off a loan, to buy a new tractor, to keep the bank from calling. The men at the co-op talked of little else. They debated the price per foot, the terms of the contracts, the damage the heavy equipment would do to their fields. But they all agreed on one thing: you took the money. You had to. Arthur Pearsall had not taken the money. He had received the same certified letters as everyone else. He had met with the company's land agent. He had listened politely, his hands resting on his knees, and when the man was finished with his presentation, Arthur had given his answer. It was a single word: no. The land agent, a young man named Robert Shaw who wore polished boots that had never known mud, had been incredulous. He had laid out the numbers again, tapping his pen on the official-looking documents. He had explained that the pipeline was a matter of national interest, that they had the right of eminent domain. He said they preferred to reach a friendly agreement, but the pipeline was coming through regardless. It was better to cooperate. Arthur had simply shaken his head. He did not explain himself. He did not argue. He just sat on his porch swing, the chains groaning softly, and repeated his answer. The farm was not for sale, and no easement would be granted. Not for any price. The crisis, therefore, was not the drought, which was an act of God he could do nothing about. The crisis was the pipeline, which was an act of men he was determined to stop. The problem was insurmountable in the eyes of everyone else. The company had lawyers, money, and the government on its side. Arthur Pearsall had a worn-out flannel shirt, a deed signed by his great-grandfather, and a quiet, unshakable resolve. The history of this particular conflict was short, but the history of the land was long. For nearly a century, the Pearsall family had worked this ground. They had survived droughts worse than this one, floods that had turned the valley into a lake, and economic depressions that had wiped out their neighbors. They had done so not through luck, but through a deep and intimate knowledge of their 200 acres. They knew its moods, its secrets, its strengths, and its weaknesses. Other farmers had drilled deep wells, chasing the water table as it fell. They had installed expensive irrigation systems, going into debt for pivots that now sat idle, pointing like skeletal fingers at a brassy, unforgiving sky. They had failed. Their ponds were dry, their wells were sucking air, and their fields were barren. The county agent had declared a state of emergency. The prevailing wisdom was that the land was tapped out, that the water was gone. It was a permanent, unsolvable condition of modern farming in a dry year. Arthur knew better. He knew the water was not gone. He knew where it was. He had known since he was a boy of 10, walking this same land with his father. He did this quietly, holding a knowledge that no surveyor's map or county agent's report could ever show. This knowledge was the reason he had refused the pipeline's money. It was the reason he was not afraid of the drought. And it was the reason he would not yield. Robert Shaw drove a Ford F-150, a new model from that year, 1988. It was a deep metallic blue, and he kept it impeccably clean, even with the dust that coated every surface in Grayson County. He was a man in his late 20s, with a business degree from the state university and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He believed in data, in contracts, in a logical progression of capital and infrastructure. He saw the world as a series of problems to be solved with efficiency and the correct application of money. When he first visited Arthur Pearsall, he had seen a relic, an old farmer on a failing piece of land. The farmhouse needed a coat of paint. The barn roof was patched in 2 different shades of tin. The tractor in the shed was an Alice Chalmers from the 1960s, a model he had only seen in pictures. His initial assessment was filed in a manila folder with Arthur's name on it. Subject is elderly, operating a subsistence-level farm. Property value is low due to lack of modern irrigation and poor crop yields. Susceptible to standard offer. His assessment was based on the county assessor's maps, soil surveys from the Department of Agriculture, and the observable evidence of the drought. The Pearsall property was classified as having predominantly silta loam, good for corn in wet years, but poor at retaining moisture. The official hydrological maps showed no significant aquifer beneath the property. The nearest reliable water source was the county reservoir, 5 miles to the south and 20 feet below its normal level. Shaw had made his offer based on this data. He offered Arthur $15,000 for a permanent easement. It was a generous offer, he had explained, well above the market rate for dry pasture land. He presented it as a kindness, a helping hand to an old man whose farm was clearly on its last legs. Arthur's refusal had baffled him. It was illogical. It went against the data. Shaw had returned to his regional office and reported the anomaly. His supervisor had told him to increase the offer. Every man has his price, the supervisor had said, a phrase Shaw believed to be a fundamental law of economics. Go back and find his. So Shaw went back. He offered $20,000, then $25,000. He talked about the benefits to the community, the jobs the pipeline would create. He hinted at the legal power of eminent domain, the unpleasantness of a court battle. He tried every tactic in the land agent's playbook. Each time, he was met with the same quiet, unmovable no. Shaw's professional frustration grew into a personal one. He began to see Arthur not just as an obstacle, but as a fool, a stubborn old man, clinging to a worthless piece of rock and dust out of sheer, irrational pride. He started talking about it with the other land agents and with the locals he met at the diner where he took his lunch. The chorus of skeptics was easy to find. At the Grayson County Farmers Co-op, the men gathered in the mornings for coffee, sitting on overturned buckets and sacks of feed. They were good men, but they were beaten down by the heat, the debt, and the endless, cloudless sky. They saw Arthur Pearsall's standoff as a kind of madness. Heard Arthur turn them down again, one would say, stirring his coffee with a wooden stick. $25,000. I'd have taken that in a heartbeat. He's always been different, Arthur has, another would add. His father was the same way. Thought he knew better than anyone. Pride's a poor crop to take to market. A third would conclude, and the others would nod in grim agreement. They felt a mixture of pity and resentment. Pity for the old man who was too stubborn to see reason. Resentment because his refusal was a silent judgment on their own capitulation. If Arthur could say no, why couldn't they? The thought was uncomfortable, so they dismissed it. They decided he was foolish, that his land was the worst hit of all, and that soon enough the pipeline company's lawyers would take it anyway, and he would end up with nothing. This consensus solidified Robert Shaw's opinion. He was not dealing with a savvy negotiator. He was dealing with a senile farmer. He filed his final report. Subject is non-cooperative. Recommend proceeding with legal action for condemnation under eminent domain. Property is marginal and presents no unusual geological or hydrological obstacles. Acquisition should be straightforward. The report was sent up the chain of command, and the lawyers in Houston began to draw up the papers. Shaw moved on, focusing on securing the easements from Arthur's more reasonable neighbors. He was confident that the Pearsall problem would soon be solved by a judge. He did not give the old man another thought. Arthur did not care what they said at the co-op. He did not care what Robertshaw wrote in his reports. His mind was not on their world of contracts and courtrooms. It was on a conversation he had had more than 60 years before in the shade of a massive oak tree that still stood by the barn. The narrative of his knowledge began there. He had been a boy, 10 years old, and it was another dry summer, 1926. The creek was low then, too, and his father, Elias Pearsall, had taken him on a walk. Elias was a man much like Arthur would become, quiet, observant, with hands that looked as if they were part of the earth itself. He did not speak often, but when he did, his words had the weight of stone. They had walked to the eastern ridge, the highest point on the property. From there, they could see the whole farm laid out below them. Elias had pointed not at the fields, but at the ground beneath their feet. The ridge was not soil, but exposed limestone, a pale gray rock full of ancient sea fossils. Most people see this rock and they see a problem, Elias had said, his voice low and steady. They see land that's hard to plow, land where nothing will grow. They're wrong. He had knelt down and brushed the dust from a fissure in the rock, a crack no wider than his hand. The rock is the reason we're still here, he had continued. Down below, deep in the earth, this same rock is full of holes. Like a sponge. It holds water from 100 miles north of here. Water that fell as rain a year ago, 10 years ago, maybe 100 years ago. The boy Arthur had listened, trying to picture this underground river, this hidden sponge of rock. It seemed like a story, a piece of folklore. The water is always there, Elias had said, looking his son directly in the eye. It doesn't go away. It just goes to ground. The secret isn't to find more rain. The secret is to know where the ground will give it back to you. This was the core principle, the central thesis of the Pearsall farm. The water was not in the sky. It was in the earth. While others looked up and prayed for clouds, Elias and his son had looked down. They had learned to read the land. They knew that a patch of deep green clover in a dry pasture meant moisture close to the surface. They knew that a line of willow trees in a gully meant a seep spring, even if no water was visible. They understood the subtle language of the geology beneath them. The mentor figure in Arthur's life was his father, but his father's knowledge was not just oral. It was recorded. Back in the farmhouse, in the bottom drawer of a heavy oak desk, was the physical manifestation of this wisdom, a set of 3 leather-bound ledgers. Elias Pearsall had kept meticulous records. Starting in 1905, he had documented everything. Daily rainfall, measured in a simple gauge he had made from a tin can. The dates he planted and harvested each crop. The price he got for his corn at the market. But the most important entries were the ones about water. He had mapped every spring on the property. He had recorded the flow rates in wet years and dry. In 1922, he had spent a whole summer with a shovel and a mule digging a series of test pits, mapping the depth of the topsoil and the point where it met the clay subsoil. He logged it all in his neat, deliberate script. The most detailed section was about the old cistern. In the 1930s, during the great drought that had turned Oklahoma to dust, Elias had decided to build a reservoir. Not a pond, which would evaporate under the sun, but an underground tank. He had found a natural depression on the north side of the ridge, a place where the limestone was close to the surface. He had observed that after the rare summer thunderstorm, water would pool there and disappear into the ground within an hour. He knew it was a recharge point for the aquifer. With his 2 sons, Arthur and his older brother Thomas, Elias had spent 2 years digging. They used dynamite to break up the rock and a mule-drawn scraper to haul it away. They dug down 20 feet, creating a stone-lined cistern 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. They had hit a fissure in the limestone that gushed clear, cold water. It was an artesian spring, fed by the pressure from the vast underground aquifer his father had spoken of. The cistern had filled in 3 days. Elias had capped it with heavy oak timbers and covered it with a mound of earth. He installed a simple hand pump and later a small gasoline engine pump. For 20 years, That cistern had provided all the water the farm needed. It had watered their cattle, irrigated a small vegetable garden, and supplied the house, even in the driest years. After Elias died in 1958 and the county ran a municipal water line down the main road, the cistern fell into disuse. It was easier to turn on a tap. The pump rusted. The oak timbers rotted. Eventually, the earthen mound settled and was overgrown with weeds and brush. To anyone else, it was just a forgotten hollow in an unused pasture. The county maps did not show it. The official records did not mention it. But Arthur had not forgotten. He had been there. He had dug it with his own hands. He knew what lay beneath the tangle of wild blackberry bushes. And so, in the fourth week of August, 1988, when the drought was at its worst and the pipeline company was preparing its legal assault, Arthur Pearsall made his decision. He would not hire a lawyer. He would not argue with Robert Shaw. He would act. He would reopen the cistern. The work began without ceremony. One morning, just after dawn, Arthur walked to the implement shed. The air was already thick with heat. He ignored the newer, larger John Deere tractor his son used for planting. He went to the back of the shed, to the old Allis-Chalmers HD 6 crawler. It was a 1962 model with a diesel engine and a heavy-duty backhoe attachment. It was a loud, crude, powerful machine, and Arthur knew its every quirk. He checked the oil and the fuel. He greased the fittings on the backhoe joints. The battery was weak, as it always was. He had to use the ether starting fluid, a dangerous but effective trick. He sprayed a small amount into the air intake, climbed into the iron seat, and hit the starter. The engine coughed, sputtered black smoke, and then roared to life with a deafening clatter that echoed across the silent fields. He let it warm up for a full 10 minutes, the sound a declaration of intent. Then he engaged the tracks, and the old machine lurched forward, leaving deep cleat marks in the dry soil. He drove it slowly, carefully, out of the shed and across the parched pasture, heading for the overgrown hollow on the north side of the ridge. The tools he used were unconventional by the standards of 1988. He had no laser level, no transit, no modern earth-moving equipment. His primary tool was the old crawler. His secondary tools were a long-handled shovel with a worn, polished blade, a heavy pickaxe, and a 5-foot steel pry bar. These are the same tools his father had used. They were extensions of his own hands. He reached the site and stopped the tractor. For a long time, he just sat in the seat, the engine idling, and studied the ground. He was looking for the subtle signs his father had taught him to see, the specific species of deep-rooted weeds that indicated the edge of the old excavation, the slight depression in the center, where the oak timbers had collapsed long ago. He spent the entire first day just clearing the brush. He used the backhoe bucket like a giant rake, scraping away the blackberry bushes and sapling trees. It was slow, tedious work. He had to be careful not to disturb the ground too much. By late afternoon, he had cleared a 50 by 20 foot rectangle. The outline of the old cistern was now visible, a faint scar on the land. He shut down the tractor and went home, his body aching with the vibration of the old machine. The process was deliberate and methodical. It was a conversation with the past. Each scoop of the backhoe was an act of memory. On the second day, he began to dig. He started at one end, carefully removing the collapsed earth and rotted wood. The top layer was a foot of black soil, rich with decades of decayed leaves. Below there was the dense, red clay of the subsoil. He found the remains of the oak timbers, now just soft, punky masses of cellulose that fell apart in the bucket. He dug deeper, following the line of the original stone walls his father had set. The stones were still there, massive blocks of limestone, fitted together without mortar. He remembered placing some of them himself, his teenage muscles straining against their weight. The work took on a rhythm. Dig with the backhoe until he hit a large rock or reached the wall. Climb down from the tractor. Use the shovel and the pry bar to clean the edges and move the stones he couldn't get with the bucket. Climb back up. Repeat. The sun was relentless. He wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and drank water from a galvanized steel jug he kept in the shade of a small cedar tree. He did not rush. Skeptics observed his strange labor from a distance. His nearest neighbor, a dairy farmer named Frank Miller, saw the plume of diesel smoke from the old tractor and drove his truck down the fence line to see what was happening. He saw Arthur, alone in the heat, digging a large hole in the ground. "What are you doing out here, Arthur?" Frank shouted over the noise of the engine. Arthur shut the tractor off. The sudden silence was immense. "Opening up the old cistern," he said, his voice hoarse from the dust. Frank Miller looked at the hole, then at the baked, empty pasture. He shook his head. "There's no water here, Arthur. Hasn't been for months. You're going to kill yourself out in this sun for nothing." He was trying to be kind, to offer the voice of reason. "There's water," Arthur said. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact. Frank left, convinced the old man had finally cracked under the strain of the drought. The story spread quickly. Arthur Pearsall was digging for water with a shovel and a museum piece of a tractor. The men at the co-op had a new topic of conversation. It confirmed their belief that he was a fool. They laughed, but it was a sad, uncomfortable kind of laughter. It was the sound of men who had given up watching a man who had not. Robert Shaw heard the story, too. He was in the county seat, filing some paperwork at the courthouse, when he ran into one of the other farmers he had signed a contract with. The farmer told him about Arthur's project. Shaw smiled. It was perfect. When the condemnation case went to court, this would be evidence of the old man's incompetence, his detachment from reality. He imagined telling the story to the judge. "Your Honor, the defendant was attempting to excavate a dry hole with antique farm equipment while refusing a $25,000 cash offer. It would make his case for him." He dismissed it as the final, pathetic act of a defeated man. For 2 weeks, Arthur worked. He dug deeper and deeper into the earth. The hole grew, a precise, rectangular wound in the dry pasture. He uncovered the stone walls, foot by foot. They were just as his father had built them, a testament to careful, patient labor. He hauled the dirt and debris away, piling it neatly to one side. He was not just digging a hole. He was restoring a structure. He reached a depth of 15 feet. The air in the bottom of the pit was cooler, smelling of damp earth and stone. The clay was becoming moist. It stuck to his shovel. This was the first sign. He felt a quiet, steady sense of confirmation. He was on the right path. Then, on the morning of the 15th day, it happened. He was at the bottom of the excavation, clearing loose rock from the floor with his shovel. He pried up a flat piece of shale, and from beneath it, a small trickle of water appeared. It was not a gush, not a flood. It was just a seep, a slow welling up from the earth. The water was shockingly cold. He knelt and touched it with his fingers. It was real. He watched it for an hour. The trickle became a steady flow, pooling on the stone floor. It was perfectly clear. He tasted it. It was sweet and clean, with a faint, mineral taste of limestone. He climbed out of the pit and walked back to the house. He did not feel triumphant. He felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The work was not finished, but the truth had been revealed. The water was there. It had always been there. Over the next 3 days, the first signs of success became undeniable. The water level in the bottom of the cistern rose steadily. The initial trickle from a single fissure was joined by others. Water began to weep from the joints between the stone blocks of the walls, running in clean rivulets down to the floor. The bottom of the pit was now a shallow pool, the surface reflecting the bright, empty blue of the sky. Arthur continued his work, clearing the last of the debris from the far end of the cistern. He worked in ankle-deep water, the cold a welcome relief from the oppressive heat. By the end of the 3rd day, the water was a foot deep across the entire 50-foot length of the floor. The inflow was constant, a gentle but persistent yungchu from the fractured rock. He estimated it was filling at a rate of several inches per hour. The math did not require a pencil. The spring was strong. The reevaluation from the outside world came unexpectedly. Robert Shaw had to drive down Arthur's Road to visit the next farm on his list, the Miller place, to finalize the easement contract. He had not intended to stop, but as he drove past the Pearsall property, he saw the old Alice Chalmers tractor parked by the excavation site, and on a whim, he slowed his truck. His curiosity got the better of him. He He wanted to see the pathetic dry hole the old man had wasted his time on. He pulled his truck onto the shoulder and got out. He walked to the fence line, the dry grass crunching under his polished boots. From a distance, it looked just as he had imagined, a pile of dirt, an old tractor, and a hole in the ground. But as he got closer, he noticed something strange. The pile of excavated earth was dark and damp at its base, and there was a sound, a faint but distinct sound of a small engine running. He peered over the fence. Arthur had set up a small, one-cylinder gasoline pump on the edge of the cistern. A suction hose ran down into the hole, and a canvas discharge hose snaked out across the pasture. A steady stream of clear water was pouring from the end of the hose, creating a dark, spreading patch on the parched ground. The water was not being pumped in. It was being pumped out. Shaw stood motionless, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It was impossible. The county was in the worst drought in 50 years. The official geological surveys showed no water here. Yet he was looking at it. A spring so strong it was filling a massive excavation faster than the old man could pump it out. He watched for a long time. He saw Arthur climb down a makeshift ladder into the pit, the water now up to his knees, and work on clearing a final section of the wall. Shaw felt a disorienting mix of disbelief and a dawning, uncomfortable respect. His data was wrong. His assessment was wrong. The spreadsheets, the maps, the official reports, all of it was wrong. The old man he had dismissed as a fool was standing in a self-made oasis in the middle of a desert. Shaw got back in his truck without a word. The drive to the Miller farm was quiet. The smug certainty he had carried with him for weeks had evaporated, replaced by a profound and unsettling doubt. He had built his career on being right, on understanding the value of things. And he had just been proven, in the most undeniable way possible, to be completely and utterly wrong. The climax of the situation arrived a week later. Shaw's report on the Pearsall water source had caused a stir at the Transcontinental Regional Office. An unexpected water source of that magnitude could be a major complication or a major asset. The pipeline needed vast quantities of water for hydrostatic testing, the process of pressure testing the welded pipe sections before they were buried. They were planning to truck water in from the county reservoir at great expense. His supervisor, a pragmatic engineer named Davies, had been skeptical of Shaw's report. He dispatched a company geologist to verify the claim. The geologist was a young man named Ben Carter. He was quiet, thoughtful, and carried the tools of his trade: topographical maps, a Brunton compass, and a healthy skepticism for the claims of land agents. Ben Carter arrived at the Pearsall farm with Robert Shaw. Shaw was subdued, humbled. He introduced Ben to Arthur, who was busy reinforcing the top edge of the cistern wall. Arthur simply nodded at the two men and went back to his work. Ben did not talk much at first. He walked the perimeter of the cistern, studying the excavated rock pile. He picked up pieces of the limestone, examining the fossil patterns. He knelt at the edge of the pit and looked at the water, which was now more than 10 feet deep. Arthur had turned off the pump, and it had filled steadily. "May I take a sample?" Ben asked Arthur. Arthur shrugged. "It's just water." Ben lowered a sampling bottle into the cistern and pulled up a liter of the clear, cold liquid. He tested its temperature: 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Groundwater, deep groundwater. Surface water in the ponds that were not yet dry was over 80 degrees. He tested the pH and the mineral content with a small field kit. It was classic limestone aquifer water, high in calcium carbonate, low in contaminants. He spent the next hour walking the ridge above the cistern, his eyes on the ground. He consulted his topographical map, then the company's geological survey maps. He saw what the original surveyors had missed. They had mapped the major fault lines, but had ignored the thousands of smaller secondary fissures and karst features typical of this type of formation. He saw the subtle dips and rises in the land that indicated an underlying network of solution channels in the limestone, a subterranean plumbing system. He returned to the cistern, where Shaw was waiting impatiently. "Well?" Shaw asked. "He's not just tapping a spring," Ben said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "He's tapped into the main channel of the Grayson Karst aquifer. Our maps show it terminating about 2 miles north of here. They're wrong. It runs right under this ridge. Ben pulled out a portable flow meter. He asked Arthur to start the pump again. They measured the output from the discharge hose. It was pumping a steady 90 gallons a minute. And the water level in the cistern is barely dropping, Ben observed. The recharge rate is at least equal to what he's pumping out. Probably more. He did some quick calculations in his notebook. We could probably pull 500 gallons a minute from this source, and it wouldn't run dry. The success was now quantified. 500 gallons a minute. That was over 700,000 gallons a day. It was more than the local town used. It was more than enough for the pipeline's hydrostatic testing needs for the entire 50-mile section. The water they were planning to pay a fortune to truck in was right here, bubbling up out of the ground on the property of the man they were about to take to court. Robert Shaw stood silently, the numbers echoing in his head. His initial offer of $25,000 for the easement seemed absurd now. The value of this water was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. He had not just misjudged an old man. He had misjudged the value of the land by an order of magnitude. His entire framework for understanding the world had been shattered. The old man, Arthur Pearsall, who had been listening quietly, shut off the pump. The engine sputtered into silence. He looked at the two young men, then at the deep, still water in his cistern. He did not smile. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply picked up his shovel and went back to his work. The result spoke for itself. The foil returned 2 days later. Robert Shaw drove up the long lane to Arthur's farmhouse alone. He parked his clean Ford truck next to the dusty Allis-Chalmers crawler. It was late in the afternoon, and the light had softened, casting long shadows from the oak trees. The air had cooled slightly. There was a sense of peace on the farm that Shaw had never noticed before. He found Arthur in the barn, sharpening the blade of an old scythe on a grinding wheel. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. Shaw stood in the wide doorway for a moment, waiting to be acknowledged. Arthur finished his pass on the blade, stopped the wheel, and looked up. He showed no surprise. "Mr. Pearsall," Shaw began, his voice uncertain. He had rehearsed this moment, but the words felt hollow now. I wanted to talk." Arthur wiped the scythe blade with an oily rag. He waited. He was not going to make this easy for the young man, but he was not going to make it impossible, either. He simply offered him the silence to fill. "I was wrong," Shaw said finally. The words came out plainly, without flourish. It was a simple admission of a massive error. "My assessment of your property was completely wrong. What you have here, this water, it's the most valuable resource in the county right now. And I dismissed it. I dismissed you." The acknowledgement hung in the air of the barn, thick with the smell of old hay and engine oil. It was the apology Arthur had never asked for, but the one Shaw needed to give. For the first time, Shaw was not a land agent trying to close a deal. He was just a man admitting his ignorance to someone who possessed a deeper wisdom. Arthur nodded slowly. He leaned the scythe against the wall. "The water was always there," he said. It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact, the same one he had made to his neighbor. "But how did you know?" Shaw asked, the question driven by a genuine need to understand. "The maps, the surveys, the experts, they all said this land was dry." "How could you be so sure?" This was the moment for the explanation. Arthur did not gloat. He did not lecture. He simply and calmly explained the truth as he had learned it. He told Shaw about his father, about walking the land as a boy. He described the limestone sponge deep in the earth. He explained the principle that the water doesn't disappear, it just goes to ground. He led Shaw out of the barn and back to the house. He opened the bottom drawer of the old oak desk and took out one of his father's leather-bound ledgers. He opened it on the kitchen table. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the records were clear. He showed Shaw the hand-drawn maps of the springs, the rainfall measurements from the 1920s, the detailed log of the cistern's construction in the 1930s. "My father didn't have a geology degree," Arthur said, his finger tracing a line of his father's script. "But he paid attention. He watched this land for 50 years. He learned what it had to say. Most people don't listen anymore. They look at a piece of paper, a map, and they think they know the place." Shaw looked at the ledger, at the decades of patient observation recorded by hand. It was a form of data he had never considered. It was qualitative, anecdotal, ancient, and it was more accurate than anything his company's multi-million-dollar surveys had produced. He was looking at the source code of the land, written by a man who had learned its language. The lesson was profound. The knowledge that mattered was not always the knowledge that was certified, printed, and filed. Sometimes it was the knowledge that was lived, passed down, and earned through a lifetime of intimacy with a single place. The systemic change came swiftly. Shaw's report, now co-signed by the geologist Ben Carter, landed on the desk of the vice president of operations in Houston. The legal action against Arthur Pearsall was dropped immediately. The focus shifted from acquisition to negotiation. They needed the water, and Arthur owned it. The power dynamic had completely inverted. A new team was sent from Houston, not land agents, but senior water resource managers. They arrived not with threats of eminent domain, but with respectful offers. Arthur met with them at his kitchen table. He was not intimidated. He listened to their proposals, their offers of payment per gallon, their plans for laying a temporary pipe to the pipeline corridor. He let them do all the talking. When they were finished, he gave them his terms. They were simple and non-negotiable. First, the pipeline's route would be moved. It would not cross his property. It would be rerouted to the south, along the far side of the county road. This would cost the company millions in surveying and acquisitions, but he did not care. His land would not be cut. Second, they could buy his water. He named a price per gallon that was 5 times what they had planned to pay for water from the reservoir. He would control the pump. He would monitor the usage. He would be paid weekly. Third, and last, the company would, at its own expense, properly finish the cistern. They would bring in a crew to install a permanent concrete cap, a new high-capacity submersible pump, and run a permanent line for his own use to his barn and house. The cistern would be made a permanent, modern feature of his farm. The managers were taken aback by his audacity. They tried to negotiate. Arthur simply stood up. "Those are my terms," he said. "Take them or leave them." He knew they had no choice. The drought was getting worse. The cost of delay was greater than the cost of his demands. They took them. The knowledge was adopted. Ben Carter, the young geologist, became a regular visitor at the Pearsall farm. He was fascinated by Elias Pearsall's ledgers. With Arthur's permission, he began to digitize the records, integrating the old, hand-drawn maps with modern GPS data. He realized the Pearsall family's observations were a unique and invaluable data set, a century-long record of the local hydrology that existed nowhere else. He learned from Arthur how to read the land, to see the subtle clues in the vegetation and the topography. He started a new initiative within Transcontinental, a program to incorporate local and historical knowledge into their surveying process. He argued that it was not just about respecting landowners. It was about better science and avoiding costly mistakes. His superiors, humbled by the Grayson County incident, listened. The company's procedures began to change. The lesson learned on Arthur Pearsall's 200 acres began to ripple outward. The old Allis-Chalmers HD 6-crawler sat parked by the barn, its work done. It was covered in a fine layer of dust, but Arthur kept the engine oiled and ready. It was more than a machine. It was a symbol of the Pearsall way of doing things. Old, reliable, underestimated, but perfectly suited for the task at hand. It represented a time when people understood their tools not as disposable commodities, but as lifelong partners in their work. It symbolized the durability of the old ways, the power of self-reliance. The cistern, now capped with a neat slab of concrete and equipped with a silent, efficient electric pump, became the enduring symbol of the story. It was a permanent feature of the landscape, a testament to the wisdom that lay beneath the surface. It was a physical manifestation of the family's core principle. The water is always there if you know where to look. The new stasis settled over the farm and the county. The pipeline was built, but ran along the road, leaving Arthur's fields untouched. The drought eventually broke, as all droughts do, but the memory of it remained. The story of Arthur Pearsall and the pipeline became a piece of local lore, told and retold at the co-op. The laughter was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. Arthur was no longer seen as a fool, but as a man who knew something everyone else had forgotten. His farm was now recognized as the most water-secure property in the region. While others worried about the next dry spell, Arthur's cistern remained full, a hidden reservoir of certainty in an uncertain world. It was no longer a remarkable discovery. It was simply a fact, a part of the local geography. The new normal was that the driest-looking farm in the county had the most water. The torch was passed not to a son or a daughter, but to the young geologist. Ben Carter continued his visits long after the pipeline was completed. He brought Arthur new topographical maps, and Arthur would spread them on the kitchen table and point out things the maps didn't show: an old spring that had vanished in the 40s, a patch of ground that always held the frost longer in winter. One afternoon, Ben brought a young intern from his office with him. He introduced her to Arthur. "This is Mr. Pearsall," Ben said. "He's going to teach us about this land." Arthur, who had never thought of himself as a teacher, simply nodded and led them out to the ridge. He knelt down, just as his father had done 60 years before, and brushed the dust from a fissure in the limestone. He began to speak, his voice low and steady, passing on the words his father had given him. The young intern listened, her pen poised over her notebook, ready to record a different kind of data. Ben watched, knowing he was witnessing the continuation of a legacy, the transfer of a wisdom more valuable than any gas the pipeline could ever carry. He had understood the lesson. The knowledge was safe. Some things do not become obsolete. They are not replaced by new technologies or new ways of thinking. They are simply forgotten for a time. They wait patiently beneath the surface, like water in a stone, for people to remember why they were true in the first place. They wait for someone to start digging.